It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Emily Carter from Princeton University for this Marvel Distinguished Lecture, part of the Marvel NCCR Center that is overseen by Nicola Marzari here, and many participants, many of you operating and working within that center and across the rest of Switzerland. Brief introduction to Emily without going through the whole thing. That would take up so much time out of her presentation time that I'll try to cut it short. She got her PhD in 1987 working with Bill Goddard at Caltech. She did a year of postdoc with James Hines at University of Colorado, and then went as assistant professor to UCLA. She quickly rose through the ranks and became full professor at UCLA in 1994. And then 10 years after that, she decided to, she was in chemistry at UCLA, and then she crossed over to the dark side of engineering by moving to Princeton in 2004, where she was a professor in mechanical and aerospace engineering and also in computational applied math, or applied computational mathematics at Princeton. She was appointed to the Arthur Marx Chair in 2006. In 2010, she became the founding director of the Andlinger Energy Center, or Center for Energy and Environment at Princeton. In 2011, she became the Andlinger Professor. And in 2016, she was appointed to be Dean of Engineering at Princeton, where she is as of today. However, on September 1st, she will take two new jobs, going back to UCLA, and she'll be both the executive vice chancellor and the provost at UCLA. Emily is very well known in a number of fields. I'll work backwards historically. She's doing a lot of work in catalysis now and in the past, but more now in solar cells, innovations in electronic structure theory that we'll hear a little bit about, metals such as magnesium and hydrogen embrittlement, where we intersected some years ago, surface science, and other topics. That's just the sort of smattering of things where she's been very productive and had a lot of impact in the field. She has many, many, many honors and awards. I will mention three of them. One is that she's a member of the National Academy of Science in the US. The second one is that she's a member or a fellow of the National Academy of Engineering. And that double, both in engineering and science, is very rare. There are not that many people in the US who are in that category. And the third one is just a local one. In 2012, she had received an honorary doctorate from EPFL in recognition of her contributions to the field. So with that, as brief as I could make it introduction, it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Carter to the floor to tell us about the quantum simulation of sustainable energy materials. Emily.
Thank you, Bill, for that very kind introduction. Can you hear me in the back? Yes, okay, good. So, right, this is a materials lecture. I gather that most of you are probably doing theoretical work. Is that a fair statement? So that's why in this talk, when I give a more general talk, I don't spend as much time on the theory, but I will tell you a little bit more than I often do about how it works. So let's get started. So first, what I thought I would do very quickly is just give you an overview. I've been essentially for the last 12 years, about a dozen years, after reading the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change science portion of the 2007 report, I would say I woke up and realized that I felt an obligation to be thinking and being very intentional about the research that I do, and I wanted to really move as much of my research portfolio as possible to working on sustainable energy and using my expertise to try to help get us off of fossil fuels. So what you're going to see is a set of projects, some of which have sunsetted, that relate to sustainable energy technologies. And so the first has to do with sustainable electricity production. So that includes actually ongoing work on alternative solar cells that's been funded by the Department of Energy, Basic Energy Sciences. We had a project on solid oxide fuel cell materials for a few years, for 5 years. And then I will tell you about some work related to fusion reactor wall materials. We're close enough to where ITER is being built that I assume that all of you know about that an international project to build a demonstration fusion reactor. We also worked for 5 years on biofuel combustion, how to understand how to make biodiesel combust, how to characterize biodiesel combustion. Bill knows about the work that we've done on lightweight alloy design, looking at, for example, aluminum, magnesium, magnesium, lithium alloys, and their mechanical properties. And I'll talk about one of the methods that allowed us to look at large-scale defects in those kinds of materials. And then we have a lot of work now going on related to, essentially, you could call it solar fuels or solar chemicals, the idea being that you might use sunlight or along with the electrons and holes that get produced, or other ways of converting sunlight, essentially, to convert things like water and CO2, essentially running combustion backwards to create fuels of various kinds. And I'm going to talk about one of those projects because, again, it gives me an opportunity to tell you about how the theoretical methods that we've developed over the last 20 or so years can be used to understand experiments that have taken place in this field of plasmon-induced photocatalysis. And we now have a new project that has started to be funded, decided instead of just working on energy, it would also be useful to think about how to desalinate water. And so that's an electrochemical project as well that we're working on. So all of these the things that are in orange are ongoing grants. The things that are in gray have sunsetted. And given that this is a materials audience, I'm going to focus less on chemistry and more on materials. But I thought I'd also take a moment to tell you about the different kinds of techniques that have been developed in my group. If you're interested, I'm a believer that since the U.S. taxpayer paid for the development of these methods, that we should make them freely available. And so they exist on GitHub. Ones that are still under development that we don't believe people should waste time using, we don't have up on GitHub, but the things that people can use, we have there. And so those include fast wave function-based methods for doing correlated wave function calculations in this code called Tiger CI. I will be telling you, I won't be talking about that because this is for molecules. For materials, we have this code that's been used by a number of groups around the world for doing linear scaling density functional theory in its orbital-free form. And I will tell you a little bit about that, and I'm going to talk about how we use that to study fusion reactor first wall materials. These are different codes that, and methods that go along with them. And then the other theory that I'm going to talk about essentially combines wave function theory, correlated wave function theory, and density-based theories to be able to locally treat problems where density functional theory has a problem, namely with charge transfer and excited states and strong correlation, and we call this the embedded correlated wave function theory. There's another aspect of the work that we've done, which is to develop methods for having a way to derive ab initio from unrestricted Hartree-Fock calculations, U values for Hubbard U values for DFT plus U theory. And then what we do with all of these different methods is we use them often as input into dynamics. So we don't do Carr-Paranello, but we do DFT, for example, derived dynamics like many people do, Born-Oppenheimer dynamics. We use this information also to do kinetics and to do thermodynamics. And we've been doing this for a very long time, back in the really starting in the around 1990. Anyway, and then Bill was responsible, I would say, for getting me into thinking about how to use quantum mechanics, in particular orbital-free density functional theory, to couple it to solid mechanics through a program that he led. It's how we got to know each other. through a MURI project on essentially mechanical response to, so mechanical deformation of materials, and these were multi-scale methods. Anyway, that's in gray because I don't have those on GitHub, but the rest of it, these are available. Okay, and so this is a list of all the different GitHub available codes, and so you're welcome to take a look at that at some point. So let's talk about some material science problems, and in particular what I'm going to tell you about is orbital-free density functional theory, molecular dynamics simulations for fusion reactor mold materials, and then using this embedded correlated wave function theory for plasmon-induced catalysis. And so probably in this audience, I don't need to explain the details of fusion, but to say that, you know, the DT, the deuterium, tritium, hydrogen isotopes that combine and release high energy alpha particles and neutrons, basically the issue there is, you know, we know how to do that. The problem is if you start to think about any container that might be able to you know, withstand the fact that you have formed the helium nuclei, by the way, are not the problem because they're charged, and so they can be withheld. They can be controlled by the magnetic field. It's the neutrons that are the problem because the magnetic field doesn't do anything to the neutrons. So the neutrons have to go out. And the neutrons will do damage to any solid. Okay, they displace atoms in the solid, and so then you can have situations where you get embrittled solids. So one of the design ideas, it wasn't our idea, is to think about having a first wall that's a liquid instead of a solid, because liquids, all the atoms are out of place anyway, and so if you displace the atoms, it's not a big deal, and you can absorb a lot of the energy of the neutrons in that way. So that sounds great, and there's an experiment that's going on at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, which is the national lab for fusion energy in the United States for magnetic confinement fusion. And the sort of remaining challenges associated with fusion, I mean, there are, you know, if you talk to a physicist, they'll tell you there are also remaining challenges just in the fusion process itself. But in terms of when I think of the engineering challenges, really has to do with controlling the plasma, so that you don't have unstable modes in the plasma that then can hit the wall and do damage, but also the wall materials. And so there have been experiments, of course, looking at what happens to the walls, but they're all really post-mortem. And that's fine, except that you'd really like to understand what's happening when you have this particle bombardment. And so one needs, I would say, it's certainly a justification for developing fast and accurate simulations of in situ phenomena involving metals. That's the long-term goal of this work. And so I'm going to tell you about some both orbital-free density functional theory, MD, as well as some Kohn-Sham results that give us some insights into perhaps how to improve these materials. Okay, I'm also going to tell you, as I mentioned, about solar fuels and chemicals. And here in this case, the idea is that you have some material that can absorb light, and then we'll talk about plasmons in a moment, but basically it produces, it can produce essentially excited electrons and potentially excited holes, and those can then be used to do chemistry either on the particle itself or some other particle that's maybe attached to it. And this is obviously a cartoon, but the idea is then that this is another way to do essentially photoelectrochemistry. And the problem is that while this has been demonstrated in the lab, there's essentially quite low efficiency, and that's because of lots of different decay mechanisms for plasmons, and also there are limited metal choices for plasmons. And so the question is how to make that better. Again, we have the same kind of problem that in situ there really aren't any atomic scale spectroscopic experiments to be able to probe what's really happening, and so that brings up then a role for theory. In particular, though, because what's happening is there are excited electrons involved, we need to be able to describe excited state reaction pathways and possibly charge transfer. In some cases, there seems to be evidence for charge transfer. And of course, those are cases where density functional theory approximations in general don't work very well. And so what I'll tell you about briefly is our density functional embedding theory and how that couples into embedded correlated wave function theory that allows us then to study these problems, these phenomena. And these are the folks that have been involved in the work and also the funding agencies involved in the work. So let me get going here and just say that in terms of fusion reactor walls, this is one of the demonstration reactors in Garching, and it's using tungsten as the reactor wall. But there is interest in using liquids. I've already explained to you the problems with solids. And so we wanted to be able, this is actually a picture of the inside of the LTX reactor, and they're looking at lithium. There's interest in tin and gallium as possible, and possible alloys of them as possible first wall materials. So I already said this, you need accurate methods to be able to do that. And so we're going to talk about orbital-free density functional theory. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, I have just one quick slide that's going to say something about it. We have a recent review of sort of where life is. This, I think, it says, it's now a couple years old. Anyway, so you have your usual energy expression for the density, and here is the density within density functional theory. And it's a lot like Kohn-Sham theory. Okay, we involve a reference system of non-interacting electrons. We use deliberately the same exchange correlation functionals that are used in Kohn-Sham theory, but we don't have orbitals. And so what that means is that we have to use explicit density functionals for the kinetic energy. And that's something that we have spent a lot of time working on, is developing kinetic energy functionals that are accurate for different kinds of materials. The advantages of orbital-free DFT is that that it's linear scaling and it has a very small prefactor. So, in fact, in some of the mechanical properties, for example, that we used to study in multi-scale simulations, we showed that because we don't have to, for example, do K-point sampling, et cetera, because there are no wave functions here, our calculations can be up to 5 orders of magnitude faster than Kohn-Sham theory. So that's makes it so that you can do long trajectories and large sample sizes. The disadvantages are that we don't know the exact kinetic energy functional, and so one has to be very careful to only study problems where we have good functionals that can describe those materials properly. And I'm going to show you cases where we can, and then tell you about cases where we can't and where we have to resort to Kohn-Sham. We also have to use so-called local pseudopotentials, because non-local pseudopotentials, in fact, usually require projections onto orbitals, and we don't have them. So that leads to some rigidity in the description of the interaction between electrons and the screened ion, the nucleus plus the core electrons. So as a result, the accuracy has been mostly limited to main group elements. We did publish a couple of papers showing that you could, through some parameterization, introduce some angular momentum dependence such that you could treat transition metals. We did some proof of principle calculations for titanium. It's been a hard slog to get it to go further than that. That was a few years ago. It's a very hard problem. Anyway, I'm going to now move to some results and just show you, for example, how well you can do in describing the solid-liquid phase transformation in liquid lithium. And so the melting point that's been measured experimentally is 450 degrees Kelvin. This is just one example. We've done rigorous simulations, coexistence simulations between solids and liquids. If you do this sort of this simulation that sort of heats the solid and looks for where there's a discontinuity in the ion density as a function of temperature, you can also get an estimate of the melting point. shown here. And these are two different ways to do the simulations, and they bracket the experiment. So we can really describe lithium very well with orbital-free density functional theory, both in terms of the melting point, but also in terms of both the pair distribution function as well as the structure factor. The solid is our orbital-free density functional theory results, and the open circles are experiments, X-ray diffraction and neutron diffraction, and these are just, the black is low temperature and red is high temperature, and they look very good. So lithium, liquid lithium, is well described. This is not surprising because we can do very well at describing nearly free electron-like metals with our kinetic energy functionals that are based on linear response theory, away from the using the Linhard response as a way of being able to describe it properly. So anything that looks sort of nearly free electron-like, that's fairly smooth in the density, we can do a good job describing. This just shows you another property of viscosity as a function of temperature. These are pure isotopic. So this is lithium-6, lithium-7. We're doing something that's closer to lithium-7. It's off, but it's at least within the range that's expected. We can look at surface temp. We looked at a liquid lithium film. We can look at that as a function of temperature and calculate the surface tension and see that it decreases with temperature, which is what is expected, and that's also seen experimentally. The numbers are consistent with one another. We can also do liquid tin. We're in the process of doing liquid gallium. But let me just say again, looking at so I'm not showing you the results here, but we calculate a melting point that's in pretty good agreement with experiment. Static structure factor is in good agreement with experiment. Adiabatic sound velocities, the black circles are orbital-free DFT. The rest is experiment. So we can do quite a good job describing liquid tin. Here's more data, diffusivity. We also do well, as you'll see in a moment, with lithium diffusivity. The lines are simulations. The rest is experiment. This is shear viscosity as a function of temperature. So this is and black is our result. So again, we can describe liquid tin quite well with, in particular, non-local kinetic energy density functionals. So the real issue, though, is how to describe this horrible situation where you've got deuterium ions and potentially tritium ions hitting this liquid lithium, and then trying to understand what's going on there. And so there have been experiments. In fact, there were more than 10 years ago low deuterium flux experiments that suggested that there might be a maximum temperature that would be really too low for practical operation, because essentially there seemed to be, under low deuterium flux conditions, too much lithium sputtering off of the liquid film. Then experiments were done at high deuterium fluxes, and they had expected, based on various models, based on the low flux experiments, to essentially get much higher sputter yields. This is on a log scale as a function of temperature, but in fact what they saw is a much lower sputter yield. And so the question was, why was that happening? And one hypothesis was that maybe lithium deuteride is forming due to the fact that you have high concentrations of deuterium in liquid lithium. So we started to look at that, and the question is, what happens when deuterium exceeds the solubility limit in liquid lithium? I should say that when you make lithium deuteride, it melts at a much higher temperature than liquid lithium, than lithium melts at. And so what that means is that when you're at a lower temperature, you should start to nucleate small solid particles of lithium deuteride in the liquid lithium. And I'm not going to show you all the data for that, but we in fact do see that. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that deuterium has a very localized electron density, and the liquid lithium, as I just explained to you, has a very delocalized electron density. It's nearly free electron-like. We tried modeling this with orbital-free molecular dynamics, orbital-free DFT, and we could not properly describe at the same time, and we still don't have accurate enough methods to describe both a delocalized electron density at the same time as we have a localized electron density. So we had to move to using Kohn-Sham density functional theory. And what I can tell you, this is now looking at the diffusivity of deuterium and lithium as a function of inverse temperature. And what's shown in black here is pure lithium. And what's shown in black symbols is the Kohn-Sham MD simulations, which match experiment very well. Orbital-free does equally well for pure lithium, but we can't do anything else. So we can't look at what happens when we add deuterium. And so what you're seeing here is, as a function of adding deuterium, with essentially the pink being already going to pure lithium deuteride, what you see is these discontinuities in the diffusivity as a function as you cool down, and the reason that that's happening is essentially you're getting solidification, okay, and you're getting chemical bonding in particular. So I mentioned this point already, is that there's no kinetic energy density functional that can treat both smooth and sharp densities, and so all of this is generated with Kohn-Sham Born-Oppenheimer molecular dynamics. The large changes in diffusivity, and these are caused by this is predictions, by the way. There's no experimental data for this point, but we are predicting large changes in diffusivities that are caused by liquid-solid phase transformations. We can see it in snapshots that we can examine in the trajectories, and essentially at lower temperatures we see that the diffusivities are correlated. They're basically the same, suggesting that there is chemical bonding going on, and we can plot distances between lithium and deuterium atoms, and we can see distances at various times. It's fluxional, right, where you're really creating chemical bonds. And so what's happening is the deuterium is getting trapped in the liquid. And so essentially at these high exposures and at temperatures below, this is the melting point, roughly the melting point for lithium deuteride, we predict that you're going to form a mixture of solid lithium deuteride in liquid lithium. And of course that'll keep the lithium present in the solution, and it implies that the deuterium is also being sequestered in liquid lithium. And so we've suggested, and the experimentalists are testing, the idea of essentially keeping the deuterium concentration high enough to form some mixture of solid lithium deuteride and liquid lithium to improve the thermal robustness of the reactor wall. That's what may be leading to the reactor wall being having lower sputtering. So I am looking at I have a half hour, don't I? Yes, okay, that's good. So
it's a long introduction.
No, but I was remembering, I usually think about starting on the hour. So anyway, so the other thing we were interested in is, it turns out that the substrates that they're using are looking at molybdenum as a possible substrate on the wall for lithium to be kept in essentially little cavities, and so there was an interest in understanding the interactions of lithium and with molybdenum. And again, this is a case where we have to use Kohn-Sham Kohn-Sham density functional theory, because we don't have a good description of molybdenum in orbital-free DFT. So we did a lot of work just mapping out Kohn-Sham DFT interactions of lithium with a molybdenum substrate. And then what we did, because we wanted to look at wetting, how well does lithium wet the molybdenum surface, we took those Kohn-Sham density functional theory results that are shown here, and we fit a force field, an embedded atom force field for lithium molybdenum. So those results are in here, and then what we found actually is we not just looked at pristine surfaces, but we also looked at surfaces that had vacancies, molybdenum vacancies. And not surprisingly, in some sense, when you have under-coordinated metal atoms, they're going to bind things more strongly. And so lithium will bind much more strongly to molybdenum vacancies. And that actually helped us, I'm not showing the data here, but helped us understand thermal desorption experiments that were done to look at lithium desorbing from molybdenum. Basically, there were multiple peaks, the highest temperature peak corresponding to these vacancy sites. And what it suggested then is that one could start to use roughened molybdenum substrates to help enhance the film adhesion going forward in these reactors. So we use that Kohn-Sham derived embedded atom method potential to do molecular dynamics of a lithium droplet shown here. It's on a clean molybdenum 110 substrate. And I'm just showing you the beginning and the end, okay? And what we find is that because of the relatively strong binding, the lithium, ground state lithium at room temperature is body center cubic, as is molybdenum. And so there's an ordered part near the interface, and then there's a disordered part of this droplet. So this first part is essentially trying to layer and solidify a little bit, but then you're left with quite a bit that is disordered and is a liquid. So that's the prediction from the theory, that we predict actually full wetting with strong adhesion at this interface. Now it turns out experimentally they don't see it fully wet. So you have to, of course, be concerned that maybe the theory is just bad, okay? But we think that what is very likely is that there is, for sure, there is oxide on this surface, and that the oxide, wherever there is oxide that hasn't been sputtered clean, that's probably responsible for the observed incomplete wetting, because the binding, we know under ultra-high vacuum conditions without oxide around that the lithium does bind strongly to the molybdenum. So this experiment that was done in the actual reactor to study wetting was just done under conditions where there was oxygen around. So what it says, though, is it's critical to remove surface impurities to get full lithium film protection of the first wall. So just to summarize this piece of the talk, what we've learned from this, first of all, what I have shown you is that orbital-free density functional theory can do very well at describing these pure liquid metals. We still have lots of room for new contributions to figure out kinetic energy functionals that can describe both these localized densities as well as delocalized densities. So we can't really describe the deuterium bombardment yet. So that's what I'm basically saying here. Classical potential MD is still much faster than orbital-free DFT MD, but orbital-free DFT MD is much faster than Kohn-Sham DFT MD. And so from that point of view, you can think of it as this intermediate simulation method. From the Kohn-Sham MD, what we see is that there's evidence for a solid lithium deuteride sequestering in the liquid lithium, which is why that you don't see so much sputtering under the reaction, under the plasma conditions. So what it says is it's a design principle to say that you want the liquid lithium film to be as saturated with deuterium as possible to be able to operate at higher temperatures. I also showed you that we can get quite good results for I didn't show you the thermal desorption, but we can accurately simulate thermal desorption for the binding of lithium to molybdenum, and then we are able to look at this at a droplet simulation, a fairly large droplet, and how it wets under long time scale simulations for lithium film wetting. And what all of that work led to is our understanding that you'd like to have a rough film, a rough substrate, to have it bind stronger and to remove impurities, especially oxygen, to enhance the film adhesion. So currently what we're working on is, and there's one preliminary paper that just came out on lithium tin alloys. There's a lot of interest in that because it could be that that's the best of both worlds. Turns out we've shown that lithium segregates, we're writing this up now, but lithium segregates to the surface of a liquid lithium tin film. And that's good because if you're going to sputter anything, you'd like to sputter something with low atomic number that does the least damage to the plasma. And its overall vapor pressure is low, and we have other evidence that there are other good properties here. So we'll stay tuned for that work. Anyway, now I'm going to move to the second topic as another. So hopefully someday fusion will provide baseload electricity, and that's why we were working on that project. Now I'm going to talk to you about chemical conversions, catalysis, that can take advantage, exploit sunlight. And so there was actually, this work was one of the first papers that showed this. We're co-authors on this, but this work was driven by the experimentalist Professor Naomi Hallis from Rice University, who had been looking at gold nanoparticles and essentially shining visible light on these gold nanoparticles. And what they do is they can absorb, and it's not just gold that does this, any of the coinage metals, so copper and silver and gold do it, as well as aluminum, can absorb visible light, and actually tunable depending on the size of the nanoparticle, and create these so-called plasmons, which are collective excitations of the valence electrons that live on the surface of the particle. And essentially what can happen, so that's what this cartoon is showing, they can decay through various mechanisms. One of the mechanisms is to create electron hole pairs, so an excited electronic state that is in fact localized. And those electrons then can be accessed to do chemistry, so it is thought. And so this is showing you an example of the experiments that were done and that are reported in this paper. And it's showing a particularly interesting example to prove that these excited electrons are doing the chemistry. In particular, it's taking a mixture of H2 and D2 and showing that when you turn on the light, so the light is the green, that you get an increase in the rate of production of HD. Why is that a critical point? Because if you didn't have the light at all, and you just had H2 and D2 in the dark, you would not see this mixture at all because hydrogen does not dissociate on gold. Okay? So it's only in the presence of the light that you see this increase in the rate, and if you turn off the light, the rate goes back down. And so the question was, what's happening? And so she came to me and said, it seems like you have this theory that allows us to look at excited states on metals, so could you model this? Okay, so I'm going to take a moment to talk to you about this embedded correlated wave function theory. So you all know about density functional theory. It is the go-to method under most cases to study these days, to study chemical systems, also material systems, quantum mechanically. But of course, there are shortcomings that come into play. This is an exact theory, but you have to choose an approximate exchange correlation functional to apply the theory. And so those approximations lead to self-interaction errors, so interaction, artificial spurious interactions of the electrons with themselves, which then leads to charge over delocalization, inaccurate excited states, lack of van der Waals interactions, and things like that. So, in fact, the failures, this is just mentioning it again, but the point is that since we're interested in a lot of the work we're interested in has to do with transition metals, we worry about this a lot and have worked on, as I mentioned, like DFT plus U methods, et cetera. This electron self-interaction error leads to an incorrect electronic structure, and also in other work that I won't talk about it at all, we look at a lot of oxidation reduction chemistry that involves transition metal ions. And so the way to think about how to improve that is to at least use hybrid DFT, which essentially introduces some exact exchange. That's one solution. Another, though, is to recognize that because DFT is a single determinant wave function involved in DFT, it's a single electron configuration, the ground state electron configuration. It doesn't give you correct descriptions of excited states. It can't then really describe near degeneracies of electronic states, which are involved in bond breaking and in charge transfer. And so the way to treat those problems is with multi-configurational correlated wave function theories. And so how are we going to do that? Well, we do it in the following way. So I'm going to tell you this is the original paper that describes how we set up the problem, and then there's more details in a more recent review, but we start modeling this plasmon-induced chemistry first by doing a DFT calculation, a periodic DFT calculation as illustrated here. This gives us ground state structures and potential energy curves, ground state potential energy curves, which then we want to correct. We want to have a local correction for the problems associated with DFT in describing charge transfer and describing excited states. So how are we going to do that? Well, we do it essentially through carving out a piece of the system, so some amount of atoms, and then asking how do those atoms interact with the extended periodic crystal. And what we do is we solve for what we call an embedding potential. We use optimized effective potential theory so within density functional theory, to evaluate what is effectively the interaction potential between the part that we're going to treat with correlated wave function theory and the rest of the system that's being treated with density functional theory. And so that gives us these corrected both ground state and excited state potential curves. It allows us to use high-level many-body correlated wave function theory that would be impossible to do at the periodic level. I mean, you just couldn't. It would just be far too expensive, and allows us to study these charge transfer and excited state systems. This is an example of one of these embedding potentials. So here, I'm just going to lead you through in practice how this works. So we start with this periodic system. Here I've carved out a cluster of metal atoms. This is showing you the cluster. Here is the rest of the environment. And we essentially add an embedding potential that we solve for. We add that to the Hamiltonian of both the cluster and the environment. And we then apply an optimized effective potential algorithm in order to, in this particular case for density functional embedding theory, we constrain the problem by saying that the reference density, which is the full density of the periodic system, of the full periodic system, we should have that the summation of the density of the cluster, of the metal cluster, and the density of the environment, the sum of those should give back the reference density in the presence of the embedding potential. So by having that as the constraint, we can solve for this embedding potential. And then once we have that, we can calculate, we then can add using now a fixed embedding potential that describes this interaction of the cluster with the rest of the crystal. We then add the adsorbate molecules, whatever it is we're trying to study, and then we calculate a correction to a DFT energy, and we do that at the cluster level in the present. So we use this Hamiltonian now where we've solved for this embedding potential, and we calculate an embedded correlated wave function energy, and we subtract off an embedded DFT energy for that cluster so that we don't double count the energies associated with those atoms that were present in the slab. So by doing that, by starting with the energy that most people who just do DFT would have, we can get our relaxed structures. We can get actually the image potential stabilization associated that is sort of captured by a thick slab if there are polar molecules. And then we do this local correction where we subtract off part of the DFT energy from here and then add back in the correlated wave function energy to give us this essentially local correction fully ab initio to both not just to exchange like you get in hybrid functionals, but also to correlation. And we can get then non-empirical van der Waals interactions as well as excited state energies. So that's the calculation. It's not trivial. There's a lot of different steps to it. And now I'm going to show you some results. So this is showing actually looking at the system that was that first system that Naomi Hallis told me about, which is hydrogen dissociation on gold. And I'm going to just show you one potential energy surface. This is for an excited state potential energy surface. The ground state surface does what it should do, which is has a very large barrier. We know that hydrogen doesn't dissociate on gold. But if you look at the excited states that are accessible at the energies of the plasmons, it turns out that the seventh excited state has a barrier that goes down. So this is a 2D cut through a many-dimensional potential energy surface showing this is the H2 gold distance. So out here, the H2 is above the gold surface, comes in, and then the bond starts to stretch. This is the HH distance, and this is showing you where the saddle point is. These are individual calculations of using embedded correlated wave function theory. And what we see is that in this particular case, you do get charge transfer that occurs as you reach the saddle point. Charge transfer excited states with reduced barriers. And then this is showing you what happens on aluminum, just another case that actually they looked at as well, a different paper. And it's showing a different representation because I want to show you that on aluminum, unlike having a set of discrete excited states on gold, which is understandable because of the surface projected band gap that is known to exist on gold surfaces, on aluminum, which is a free electron-like metal, you get a continuum of excited states. And this is showing, it's marching along the actual minimum energy path, the ground state minimum energy path that's shown in black. So that's why you're seeing a one-dimensional coordinate here. So this is a reduced reaction coordinate I'm going to use from now on, because I'm going to be showing you multiple excited states from now on. And this is showing that you have a whole series of states that you can access. And if you get to this is completely reasonable, a 1.5 eV plasmon, that energy can be converted in such a way to really reduce the barrier if you go across. And because all of these states are basically in continuum, they should be readily accessible. And so basically this shows a way potentially, because these are calculations, sorry, these are experiments that were done at room temperature. You can use visible light to dissociate hydrogen at room temperature in this way. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to a much harder problem, and that is dissociation of nitrogen. We're interested in understanding, for example, how one could think about ammonia synthesis catalysts. I just was reading this morning, for any of you that read the U.S. trade rag, Chemical and Engineering News, there's an article about sustainable ammonia synthesis, because ammonia synthesis is responsible based on both where the hydrogen comes from and how much energy it costs both to run the reaction at high temperature and high pressure through the Haber-Bosch process. It is responsible for, I calculated, more than 1% of all CO2 emissions on the planet. Okay, and why do we use ammonia? Right, we use ammonia. Half of the fertilizer that produces our food is produced from ammonia. And ammonia shows up in all, in many chemical processes, anything that needs nitrogen. And so this is huge in terms of reducing CO2 emissions from the chemical industry. So I mentioned to you already that plasmons only occur on these denoted red elements, and so. But then if you look at elements that are active for ammonia synthesis, or we're also looking at methane activation or hydrogenation catalysts, the only one that shows both catalysis and plasmonics is copper. And so we have been looking at copper. But what we thought would be interesting is to, and Naomi Hallis's group is doing this as well, is to look at how you could combine transition metals that are known to be active thermally with plasmons to see if you could get the same chemistry to occur. So there are two possible approaches. This is the one that Naomi has mostly been doing, but we urged her, and she is now, and we do have some results for this kind of approach. What this goes along with that cartoon I showed you before, which is to say you have an antenna which is made up of one of the plasmonic metals, like in this case aluminum, that's decorated with small catalysis particles, in this case palladium, And then another possibility is to take one of the plasmonic metals and dope it at the surface. And so we studied this. I'm just going to give you one example of molybdenum doped into gold, but we've also looked at ruthenium and iron and copper, and they have been doing, they have experiments that also show that these are reactive. And anyway, so I think no, I'm still okay. Okay, so let me say that if we look at, as I mentioned, we wanted to look at not just dissociation of H2, we wanted to look at dissociation of nitrogen. Of course, that's much harder. It's a triple bond. And that is the rate-limiting step in Haber-Bosch ammonia synthesis. And this is actually data that we've superimposed some of our own results on at the DFT level, comparing the effective activation barrier to the energy, the exothermicity or endothermicity of, so the thermodynamics of dissociating nitrogen. And essentially, what we have shown is, even just at the ground state level, it looks like molybdenum doped gold in particular is sort of falls in the same category with the most active metals that are known to do Haber-Bosch chemistry. So we wanted to look at molybdenum. And so what I'm going to show you is some of the results that look at these excited states and how we think this process is happening. And it's happening through a different process, a different excitation mechanism than the hydrogen case. In the case of hydrogen, I said we have evidence for charge transfer. And that makes sense because, in fact, H2 minus is a stable molecule. N2 minus is not stable. And so you don't get charge transfer to nitrogen. You have to go through a different process. And we see, in fact, from the analysis of the wave functions, that we don't get charge transfer. What happens is actually a resonance energy transfer process has to be active. So we calculate the transition dipole moments from the wave functions to get out information about the oscillator strengths and the likelihood of those processes happening. Anyway, I don't have time to go into the details of that. You can read the paper that describes that here. But it involves, starting with gaseous N2, we're looking at, so we're combining molybdenum, a Haber-Bosch active metal, with gold, because gold can do the plasmonics. And we're going to look at molecular adsorption, and then the molecule has to reorient before it splits apart. Not surprisingly, it adsorbs to the molybdenum because that's the strongest bond, and that's where the molecule can split. So what this is just a little cartoon that is showing you, this is actually from a calculation. This is the minimum energy path to form adsorbed nitrogen, and then the molecule reorients. These are the structures from the DFT calculations of the ground state, and then dissociation goes to 2 FCC hollow sites like that. So then what we do, as I said, we do embedded correlated wave function theory. This is the particular variety of theory it is. It's a multi-configurational theory that describes both static and dynamic electron correlation. And what you're seeing is this reduced reaction coordinate, and you're seeing a whole set of excited states that we can calculate. And what comes from this, then, I'm going to lead you through this, is that initially what we calculate for the barrier associated with this for the ground state is a barrier of 4 electron volts. So of course nothing is going to happen without the plasmonics. On the other hand, we can get adsorption. So this is in yellow. Here is the yellow arrow showing you that you can get adsorption with essentially no barrier of nitrogen on the molybdenum, but then there's a barrier to come back, and then there's a huge barrier to overcome to break the bond. So what we suggested is, in fact, what's going to happen in green is that you're going to get, if you can use these gold nanoparticles, have these tunable resonances that actually go from the IR to the visible, 1 electron volt to 2.5. We can show that using 1.4 eV plasmon resonance energy transfers, we can get this reaction to happen at a much lower barrier. That sounds, you might think, well, how can that happen? Well, in fact, almost all of the plasmon-induced chemistry shows a nonlinear dependence of the laser intensity with the reaction. And that is indicative of multiphoton processes. So for sure, it in fact, what one sees, and again, that's also part of why the yield is low, these processes do in fact require multiple excitation events. So this is modeling that multiple excitation event. So we envision something like where it can be promoted up to this excited state, and then it can undergo a barrier that's only half an electron volt, almost an order of magnitude less. And it can then traverse that thermally at room temperature. And then, and that's essentially now brought us to a point where you can now undergo another excitation that allows for this reorientation to happen with a barrier of less than half an electron volt. Then one more pump up can get us to a point where the barrier to get finally to the state where the nitrogen is fully dissociated has a barrier of 0.77 electron volts. And so essentially the largest excited state barrier that has to be overcome is this is a prediction, hasn't been borne out experimentally, but this is a huge reduction in the barrier. And what our calculations, again, looking at these oscillator strings, tells us, and the fact that we don't see charge transfer, is that this is happening through resonance energy transfer, and that's what would be needed in order to get this to happen. This got a lot of people excited. There are several experimental groups that are trying to see if this works. We certainly hope it will. You can think about then having a situation where you have these molybdenum-decorated gold nanoparticles that could both dissociate H2 and dissociate N2 and potentially lead to some sustainable ammonia synthesis. It's not going to happen tomorrow. Maybe it'll never happen, but it's proof of principle that it might happen. Okay, so just as a quick summary, what we've shown is that by alloying, this is a possible way, and this has been seen now both experimentally and theoretically, to allow the kind of chemistry that can happen to be really widened. And having these sequential electronic excitations definitely allows you to access these by lowering the barrier to access this kind of chemistry. And so there's a lot of interest, a lot of groups around the world are studying this. And our technique is really the only way to be able to study these excited states of the experiments that are happening. So with that, I will stop and I have to thank the people involved. The work that I showed you in terms of plasmonics was done largely by these four individuals, and Mark Martirez is still with me. He's my most senior postdoc, and then the orbital-free DFT MD work was done by. She's now a postdoc with me. Beatriz Gonzalez Del Rio is my postdoc. Former postdoc Mohan Chen is now professor at Peking University. Joey Vela was actually Thanos Panagiotopoulos and Pablo de Benedetti's PhD student, but he worked very closely with us. He's now at ExxonMobil. And you can see where these other folks are. Florian Liebisch is now a professor at TU Wien. And anyway, and then we've had some, of course, collaborations with the experimentalists. This work was funded by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. This work was funded by the Navy. Our orbital-free DFT work was funded by the Navy. And the particular applications, to some of them to liquid metals, was funded by Fusion Energy Sciences of DOE, which also I should have up here, I forgot, and also by the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. It's lovely work. I have come to always expect. The floor is open for questions.
So you say the orbital-free method's good for kind of places where it's almost like a free electron gas. So does it work well for aluminum, for
Yes,
example?
works really well. We think of aluminum as the hydrogen atom of orbital-free DFT. Yeah, it works extremely well for aluminum.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Other questions?
So you mentioned the embedding and the wave function methods, and I was just curious to know how does the embedding potential looks like? Is it local? Is it non-local? Is it static? Is it dynamic?
Yeah, that's.
How do you deal with it, basically?
Yes, so very good. So I showed you a picture of one of them. So in the density functional embedding theory, it's a local potential. So it's a one electron, it's V of R. Okay, that's it. So it's static. There's a group, Dominic Ziegid. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Dominika Ziegid. I've never met her, but she has developed a version of embedding that is dynamic. Okay, so there's definitely interest in this. There's other work that in fact. So we have developed what we call a density matrix functional embedding theory that now produces a non-local embedding potential. We're continuing to work on that as well. It's not nearly as you can't. It's not easy to plot and sort of see what it looks like more or less. And it's of course much more expensive because it's now something which depends on both R and R prime, but we have such a method that we have published. So what we have done, we've also explored, and I can tell you that, we thought, well, maybe what one should do is along the reaction path, one should allow that embedding potential to change. That introduces lots of mischief, as it turns out. Basically, what we found that seems to give us the most robust results is to solve for this embedding potential for the bare metal. Okay, and because metals screen things well, we think we're fine. Once we bring up as long as the cluster is big enough, to bring up the molecule that's involved in the chemistry. We don't get nice potential curves if we essentially re-optimize the embedding potential along the way, because you're changing the Hamiltonian along the way in a way which is sort of not controllable. And I don't know how much experience you've had with OEP methods, but they're not. They have their issues. It's not. So there are numerical issues that can be problematic. The DFET method that I mentioned here, because we have another set of embedding theories called potential functional embedding, where we do self-consistently optimize the potential even for correlated wave functions, so we can do that. But it's numerically, we've been spending years now working on new ways to try to make it numerically more stable. So we find that this is a workhorse. We can use this routinely. It's very robust for metals. Certainly it's good enough. The others are, I would say, methods under development.
Yes. Other questions? Just a brief follow-up on that. So how do you assess the accuracy of the embedding? Because you can't really do the CW for the whole cluster.
Right.
So you have
for the whole.
You have no CW reference. So how do you decide whether you're making some important errors or not?
So we have done tests deliberately on finite systems. Okay. So that we can do small enough where we can do the full correlated wave function calculation. So that's where we can do the tests. And then what we do with respect to the other work that we've done, for example, on metals, is we increase the cluster as much as we can to see that the results are converged, and we live with that. And then we do our best to compare with experiment, and we've done that, especially for ground states. We've done quite a bit of benchmarking with respect to that. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe one question on the N2 dissociation.
Yeah.
So in the first step, the way you selected molybdenum embedded in gold as being good was based on this correlation between the dissociation energy and the barrier, right?
It was one of the ways.
It's one of the
yeah.
But do you really need this constraint, knowing that you're going to use plasmonic state anyway?
Well, I can tell you, so we have another paper, which I didn't talk about, on iron doped into gold, and the barrier is higher there. Okay, so
it works.
It works, but it's higher. Yeah. Okay. So what we did actually was, if you go look at, there's an ACS Nano paper where we looked at a bunch of different elements. I mean, one of the things we're concerned about is, anyone who's an expert on surface energies here may know that, of course, gold has a low surface energy. It'll have a lower surface energy than any of these transition metals. And so those metals should want to live inside the gold, not at the surface. So you have to kinetically stabilize them, okay? And so we proposed a way to kinetically stabilize them at the surface. But so we screened on the basis of what we thought could be stabilized at the surface too. Yeah.